7 seconds left on the timer and her hands are shaking like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Everyone else has backed away 20 feet, 30 feet, some have turned their backs, entirely unable to watch what they believe will be her final moments. The red digital numbers burn through the darkness, 654, and still she stays focused on the tangle of wires. Before her, blue, red, yellow, green, each one a choice between life and death, between saving everyone or losing everything, including herself. 3 seconds now, and something inside her clicks into place. The trembling stops. The world goes silent, except for the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, and in that moment she remembers every single person who told her she would never be strong enough, never be brave enough, never be steady enough for this job. 2 seconds left. She chooses the blue wire. 1 second. Silenci called her shaky. Sarah, behind her back, whispered about her nervous hands during weapons training, questioned whether someone who couldn't hold a coffee cup steady should ever be trusted with explosive devices or human lives. But Sarah Chen had something they couldn't see, something that only revealed itself when everything else fell apart. She grew up in a small town where her father ran the only hardware store and her mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. Ordinary people living ordinary lives until the day Sarah turned 18 and announced she was joining the army. Not just the army, but explosive ordnance disposal, the most dangerous job and the most dangerous profession in the world. Her father nearly dropped his wrench when she told him her mother actually did drop the stack of papers she was grading. Sarah Chen, who had been afraid of fireworks since she was 7, who jumped at loud noises, who had hands that shook whenever she got nervous or scared or excited, wanted to defuse bombs for a living. Shaking had started when she was 12 after a car accident that killed her older brother David. The family was driving home from his baseball game when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head on. David died instantly. Sarah spent 3 months in the hospital learning to walk, again learning to write, again learning to live with hands that trembled whenever her heart rate went up. Doctors said it was a neurological response to trauma, that it might fade with time, but it never did. If anything, it got worse as she got older, especially during moments of stress or pressure or fear, which made her decision to join explosive ordnance disposal seem like the worst possible career choice in human history. But Sarah had a secret she had discovered by accident during a house fire when she was 16. The neighbor's place was burning and the fire department hadn't arrived yet. Sarah saw their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Piatzin, trapped on the 2nd floor, and without thinking she grabbed a ladder and climbed up to help her. As she reached through the window to pull Mrs. Peterson to safety, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the window frame. But then something remarkable happened. The moment Mrs. Peterson grabbed her hand and looked into her eyes with complete trust and desperation, Sarah's hands went completely still. It was as if all that nervous energy, all that trembling uncertainty suddenly transformed into something else, something steady and sure and unshakable. The more desperate the situation became, the calmer Sarah felt. It was backwards, it was impossible, but it was real. She never told anyone about that moment, not her parents, not her friends, not even the army recruiters when she signed up. She just knew that when people needed her most, when lives hung in the balance, she became someone different, someone whose hands never shook. Basic training was a nightmare. Drill sergeants screamed at her for dropping equipment during weapons. Cleaning her rifle scores were mediocre because her hands shook during target practice. Other recruits started calling her Butterfingers and Shaky Sarah, and worse names that cut deeper than any knife bit. Sarah endured it all because she had a vision of who she could become when it mattered most. She remembered Mrs. Peterson looking at her with absolute faith, and she held onto that memory like a life preserver in a storm. Explosive ordnance disposal school was even worse. The training was designed to weed out anyone who lacked the steady nerves and precise motor control needed to work with live explosives. Sarah failed her first practical exam when her hands shook so badly she couldn't connect the training wires. She failed her second exam when she dropped a simulator detonator during a timed exercise. Instructor Sergeant Martinez was a 20-year veteran who had defused over 300 real explosive devices. He had seen every type of student come through his program, and he knew Sarah was not cut out for this work. After her third failed exam, he called her into his office. Sarah expected to be dismissed from the program, sent to some other military job where shaking hands wouldn't matter, but Sergeant Martinez surprised her, told her about his first real bomb call in Afghanistan, how his hands had shaken so badly he could barely hold his tools, how he had been terrified that his nervousness would get everyone killed. But then he said something that changed everything for Sarah. Fear is not your enemy, Sarah. Fear is information. Fear tells you that what you're doing matters, that lives are at stake, that you need to be better than you've ever been before. The question is not whether you feel fear, the question is what you do with that. Fear gave her one more chance, a final practical exam that would determine whether she stayed in the program or was transferred elsewhere. Sarah spent the night before the exam in the base chapel, not praying exactly, but trying to find that place inside herself where the shaking stopped, where fear transformed into focused. Final exam was designed to simulate real combat conditions. They placed her in a mock building with multiple fake explosive devices scattered throughout. Her job was to identify, disarm, and document each device, while instructors created distractions, loud noises, simulated gunfire, fake emergencies, designed to rattle her. Concentration. Czar entered the building and immediately felt her hands Begin to shake. The first device was simple, a basic, improvised explosive with clearly marked wires, but as she knelt beside it, her trembling fingers could barely grip the wire cutter stone. She heard something that changed everything. An instructor started playing a recording of a child crying for help, supposedly trapped somewhere in the building. Sarah knew it was fake, knew it was part of the test, but the sound of that frightened child activated something deep inside her. Suddenly her hands went still, the trembling stopped, the world narrowed down to just her and the device before her, and the knowledge that somewhere a child needed her to succeed. She worked through the first device quickly and efficiently, then moved to the second. Then the 30-odd device was more complex than the last, but Sarah's hands remained steady, her focus absolute. She finished the exam with time to spare and perfect scores on every device. Sergeant Martinez watched the security footage 3 times before he believed what he had seen. The same student who had failed 3 previous exams due to shaking hands had just completed the most difficult practical test in the program without a single tremor, without a single mistake, without a single moment of visible nervousness. Called Sarah back into his office the next day and asked her directly what had changed, what had made the difference between this exam and all the previous failures. Sarah told him about the crying child, about how the sound had made everything else disappear, about how her shaking stopped when she focused on helping someone else. Sergeant Martinez nodded slowly and made a note in her file. Then he said something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her military career. Some people are born with steady hands, Sarah, but you have something rarer. You have a steady heart when it matters most. Sarah graduated from explosive ordnance disposal school in the top 10% of her class. She was assigned to a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where her unit was responsible for clearing improvised explosive devices from supply routes and civilian areas. First real bomb was discovered buried in the road leading to a village school. Local children had been walking past it every day on their way to classes, completely unaware that one wrong step could kill them all. Sarah volunteered to handle the device despite having less experience than several other members of her unit. As she approached the buried explosive, her hands began their familiar trembling, but then she thought about those children walking to school, trusting that the road was safe, trusting that someone would protect them from dangers. They couldn't even see her hands steadied. She worked for 40 minutes in the blazing Afghan sun, carefully excavating around the device, identifying its components, tracing its wiring system. The bomb was more sophisticated than anything she had trained on, but Sarah approached it methodically, patiently, never rushing, never letting fear override her training hand. She finally clipped the correct wire and rendered the device safe. The silence that followed was broken by cheering from her teammates and from the Afghan army soldiers who had been watching from a safe distance. Sarah had just saved the lives of dozens of children who would never know how close they had come to disaster over the next 6 months. Sarah defused 17 more explosive devices, each one different, each one deadly, each one requiring perfect precision and unwavering courage. Her teammates stopped calling her Shaky Sarah and started calling her Steady Sarah, or just Steady. But the nickname that stuck came from Sergeant Rodriguez, who had watched her work on a particularly complex device planted inside a market where hundreds of civilians shopped every day. After Sarah successfully disarmed it, Rodriguez shook his head in amazement and said, "That girl has hands that only shake when they don't need to be steady." That became her reputation throughout the unit and eventually throughout the entire forward operating base. Sarah Chen, the explosive ordnance disposal specialist whose hands shook during routine training, but became rock solid when lives hung in the balance. The other soldiers began requesting her specifically for the most dangerous calls, the bombs that made everyone else nervous, the devices that seemed too complex, too risky, too likely to explode if handled by anyone without perfect control. Sarah never turned down a request, never backed away from a challenge. She developed techniques that other explosive ordnance disposal specialists, but began adopting ways of using controlled breathing and mental imagery to manage stress under pressure, ways of breaking complex devices down into simple component decisions, ways of staying calm when everything around you was chaos. But Sarah never told anyone her real secret, the thing that made her different from every other bomb technician in the military. She had learned to transform her fear into fuel, to convert her nervousness into hypervigilance, to turn her shaking hands into perfectly calibrated instruments of precision. The key was remembering why she was there, not for the mission, not for the army, not even for her teammates, but for the people who would never know her name, the children walking to school, the families shopping in markets, the travelers using roads that needed to be safe. Sarah had found her purpose in the space between life and death, in those moments when her decision meant everything and her hands meant everything, and everyone was counting on someone they barely knew to save them from invisible dangers. Her reputation grew beyond her unit, beyond her base. She was featured in military publications as an example of how proper training could overcome natural disadvantages, how determination could triumph over physical limitations. But Sarah knew they had it backwards. Her shaking hands weren't a disadvantage to overcome, they were an advantage that most people couldn't understand. They were her early warning system, her natural response to danger. that kept her hyper-aware and hyper-focused when it mattered most. Other bomb technicians had steady hands all the time, which meant they sometimes became overconfident or complacent or careless. Sarah's hands reminded her constantly that what she was doing was dangerous, that every wire mattered, that every decision could be the difference between going home and never coming home. After 18 months in Afghanistan, Sarah was rotated back to the United States and assigned to a training base where she would help prepare the next generation of explosive ordnance disposal specialists. She was nervous about teaching, worried that her shaking hands would undermine her credibility with students. But Sergeant Martinez, who had become her mentor, reminded her that her job wasn't to be perfect, her job was to be real. To show students that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to function despite fear, to do what needs to be done even when your body is telling you to run. Sarah's first class of students included several who reminded her of herself, nervous, uncertain people with physical quirks or mental challenges that made them seem unsuitable for explosive ordnance disposal work. There was James, who stuttered under pressure, Maria, whose depth perception was slightly off due to a childhood injury, and David, whose hands also shook when he got nervous. Sarah worked with each of them individually, helping them find their own ways of managing stress and fear and physical limitations. She taught them that the goal wasn't to eliminate these responses, but to work with them to transform them into tools of awareness and precision. She shared her own story with them, not as inspiration but as information. They needed to understand that being afraid meant they understood the stakes, that feeling nervous meant they took the job seriously, that having physical challenges meant they would work harder and be more careful than people who took their abilities for granted. But the most important lesson Sarah taught her students was about trust, not trusting their equipment or their training or even themselves, but trusting the people they were trying to protect to deserve their best effort no matter how difficult or dangerous the situation. She told them about Mrs. Patterson and the house fire, about the crying child recording during her final exam, about the Afghan children walking to school past buried bombs, about all the people whose lives had depended on her ability to overcome her own limitations and do what needed to be done. Sarah spent 3 years as an instructor, training over 200 explosive ordnance disposal specialists, many of whom went on to save lives in combat zones around the world. She took pride in knowing that her students were better prepared, not just technically but mentally and emotionally, for the challenges they would face. But Sarah missed fieldwork, missed the intensity and clarity that came from working with real explosive devices under real pressure. She requested reassignment to an active duty unit and was assigned to a special operations task force responsible for responding to terrorist threats within the United States. This was different from combat deployment. Instead of clearing roads and buildings in foreign countries, Sarah and her team were responsible for responding to bomb threats in American cities, schools, hospitals, government buildings, anywhere that terrorists might try to create fear and chaos. The work was more varied and often more complex than military combat because civilian targets required different approaches, different considerations, different levels of precision. Sarah found herself working in environments she had never trained for: subway tunnels, office buildings, shopping malls, places where one mistake could kill dozens or hundreds of innocent people. Her reputation followed her to the new assignment, and she quickly became the go-to specialist for the most challenging calls, the devices that other technicians looked at and decided were too risky to attempt. Sarah had defused bombs in schools, with children still inside, in hospitals, with patients who couldn't be evacuated, in government buildings, with critical operations ongoing. Each successful mission added to a legend, but Sarah tried not to think about her reputation or her success rate. She focused on the work, on the people who needed her to succeed, on the knowledge that her shaking hands were actually an advantage in a job where overconfidence could be fatal. Then came the call that would define her entire career. A terrorist cell had planted multiple explosive devices throughout a major American city. The FBI had located and secured most of the bombs, but one device remained hidden and active somewhere in a crowded shopping mall during the busiest shopping day of the year. Thousands of people were trapped inside the mall because evacuating them might trigger the bomb, but leaving them inside guaranteed casualties if the device exploded. Mall security cameras had identified the approximate location of the bomb, but not its exact position or configuration. Sarah and her team arrived to find chaos. Police had cordoned off several city blocks. SWAT teams had surrounded the building. Negotiators were trying to establish contact with the terrorists, but no one knew exactly what they were dealing with. The bomb had been placed in the mall's main food court, an area where hundreds of families were eating lunch when the alert came through. Initial reconnaissance suggested that the device was sophisticated, possibly with multiple triggers, including motion sensors that could detonate it if too many people moved at once. Sarah studied the building plans and security footage, trying to understand the bomber's mindset and methodology. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a carefully planned attack designed to maximize casualties and create maximum terror. The device would be complex, probably with redundant systems and anti-tamper mechanisms. Her team leader offered to let someone else take the lead on this call given the extreme risk and high probability of casualties, but Sarah knew that this was exactly the kind of situation she had trained for, the kind of moment when her unique combination of skills and psychological makeup could make the difference between tragedy and triumph. She volunteered to go in alone, arguing that a single person would be less likely to trigger motion sensors and would have maximum flexibility to assess and respond to whatever they found inside. Her teammates objected, pointing out that standard protocol required backup and that working alone violated every safety regulation in the book. But Sarah had worked alone before in Afghanistan when backup wasn't available or when the situation was too dangerous to risk multiple lives. She had developed techniques for solo bomb disposal that other specialists considered impossibly risky but that had never failed her. The decision was made at the highest levels of government. Sarah would enter the mall alone while thousands of shoppers remained frozen in place throughout the building. Her job was to locate the device, assess its configuration, and either disarm it or provide enough information for a controlled evacuation. As Sarah put on her protective gear and checked her equipment, she felt the familiar trembling in her hands start up, but instead of fighting it or being embarrassed by it, she welcomed it as a sign that her body understood the gravity of the situation. She entered the mall through a service entrance that led directly to the food court. The normal sounds of a busy shopping center had been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by muffled conversations and the occasional crying child. People sat at tables and in chairs, exactly where they had been when the lockdown began, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to do anything that might trigger disaster. Sarah made her way through the frozen crowd, scanning faces that showed fear, confusion, desperation, hope. She saw parents holding children close, saw elderly couples clutching each other, saw teenagers trying to look brave while their eyes betrayed their terror. Every person she passed was counting on her to save them, even though most of them had no idea who she was or what she was there to do. They just knew that someone in protective gear with specialized equipment was their only hope of getting home safely. Sarah found the device exactly where the intelligence reports had indicated, under a table in the center of the food court, partially concealed by shopping bags and food wrappers. It was larger and more complex than anything she had ever encountered, clearly the work of someone with advanced training and unlimited resources. The bomb consisted of multiple components connected by a maze of colored wires, each wire potentially leading to a different trigger mechanism or explosive charge. There were digital timers, analog backups, motion sensors, pressure plates, and what appeared to be a remote detonation system. Sarah knelt beside the device and immediately felt her hands begin to shake more violently than they had in years. This was beyond anything she had trained for, beyond anything her instructors had ever imagined, beyond anything any explosive ordnance disposal specialist had ever successfully disarmed. She closed her eyes and tried to find that place inside herself where fear transformed into focus, where trembling hands became steady instruments of precision. But the shaking continued, and if anything got worse. As she studied the device more closely, then she heard something that changed everything. A little girl at a nearby table started crying softly, calling for her mummy and saying she was scared. Sarah looked up and saw a family frozen at their table, parents and two young children who had been eating ice cream when the lockdown began. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with pigtails and a bright pink dress. She was trying so hard to be brave, but fear was overwhelming her small body. Sarah could see herself at that age, scared and confused and needing someone to make everything okay. Sarah looked around the food court and saw dozens of families, hundreds of people whose only crime was deciding to go shopping on a Saturday afternoon. They were teachers and students and retirees and workers. They were people with dreams and plans and people who loved them waiting at home. And in that moment Sarah understood something that had taken her entire career to learn. She wasn't there to disarm a bomb, she was there to protect a family, the little girl in the pink dress and her parents and brother and everyone else whose lives had been interrupted by someone else's hatred. Her hands stopped shaking completely. The trembling that had defined her entire military career simply vanished as if it had never existed. Sarah felt a calmness and clarity that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Every wire, every component, every potential trigger mechanism became crystal clear in her mind. She began working on the device, methodically tracing each wire to its source, identifying each component and its function, building a mental map of how the bomb was designed and how it could be safely disabled. The work required absolute precision because even the smallest mistake would kill everyone in the food court. Sarah discovered that the device had been designed by someone who understood explosive ordnance disposal procedures intimately. It included multiple false leads, dead-end wires that looked important but were actually decoys meant to trick bomb technicians into making fatal mistakes. But Sarah had learned something in Afghanistan that her instructors had never taught her: how to think like the bomber, to understand their psychology and methodology, to anticipate their traps and avoid their deceptions. She approached the device not as a technical challenge but as a conversation with someone who wanted to kill innocent people. After 90 minutes of careful analysis, Sarah had identified the key components that needed to be disabled to render the bomb safe. There were 3 primary triggers that had to be dealt with in a specific sequence. Any deviation from that sequence would cause immediate detonation. The first trigger was a timer that showed less than 10 minutes remaining. It was connected to the main explosive charge through a red wire that appeared to be heavily booby-trapped. Sarah studied the mechanism carefully and realized that cutting the red wire would actually trigger a backup detonator. Instead, she traced the timer circuit to its power source and discovered that disconnecting a small blue wire would disable the timing mechanism without triggering any backup systems. She made the cut cleanly and precisely and felt a wave of relief as the digital countdown stopped. The second trigger was a motion sensor designed to detonate the bomb if too many people moved around the food court. At once, Sarah realized that this was why the evacuation had been delayed. Moving hundreds of people at once would almost certainly trigger this mechanism. She located the motion sensor array and discovered that it was calibrated to detect movement within a specific range to little movement, and it would assume the sensor was malfunctioning and detonate too much movement, and it would assume an evacuation was in progress and detonate. Sarah needed to find the exact middle ground, the level of normal activity that would convince the sensor that everything was proceeding normally. She spent 20 minutes adjusting the sensor calibration until she found a sweet spot where it would remain stable regardless of movement around it. The third trigger was the most sophisticated, a remote detonation system that would allow the bomber to trigger the explosive from anywhere in the world. Sarah knew that even if she disabled the timer and motion sensor, the bomber could still detonate the device manually at any time. She traced the remote detonation circuit through a maze of wires and components, looking for a way to disable it without alerting the bomber to what she was doing. The system was designed to send a constant heartbeat signal back to the bomber. If that signal stopped, the bomb would detonate automatically. Sarah realized that she needed to maintain the heartbeat signal while disconnecting the actual detonation circuit. This required simultaneously cutting multiple wires while maintaining electrical continuity through backup connections. It was like performing surgery on a beating heart. She worked with tools in both hands, cutting, rewiring, rerouting electrical pathways while maintaining the delicate balance that kept the heartbeat signal active. One wrong move, one brief interruption in the signal would kill everyone in the building. After what felt like hours but was actually only minutes, Sarah successfully isolated the remote detonation system. The bomber could still receive signals from the device and would believe it was armed and functional, but no remote signal could actually trigger detonation. With all 3 trigger mechanisms disabled, Sarah began the final phase of her work safely, removing the explosive charges themselves. This was purely technical work requiring careful handling of unstable materials, but without the time pressure and psychological stress of the earlier phases. As she worked, Sarah became aware that the entire food court had fallen completely silent. Hundreds of people were watching her work, understanding somehow that their lives depended on every move she made. Children had stopped crying, adults had stopped whispering, even babies seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Sarah felt the weight of all those eyes on her, all those hopes and fears and desperate prayers focused on her hands. The same hands that had shaken uncontrollably during training, the same hands that had been mocked and doubted and dismissed as unsuitable for this work. But now those hands moved with absolute precision and confidence, guided by years of training and experience, but more importantly by an unshakable determination to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. Sarah finished removing the last explosive charge and sat back on her heels, looking at the pile of components that had been designed to kill hundreds of people. The bomb was completely disarmed, rendered as harmless as a broken clock, but the silence in the food court continued. Then someone started clapping slowly at first, just one person, then another, until the entire food court erupted in applause and cheers. People stood up crying and hugging and calling out thank you to the woman in protective gear who had just saved all their lives. Sarah stood up and removed her helmet, looking around at all the faces that had been frozen in fear and were now bright with relief and gratitude. She saw the little girl in the pink dress running to her parents, saw elderly couples embracing, saw teenagers crying with relief. But what Sarah remembered most clearly from that moment was not the applause or the gratitude or the relief. It was the absolute stillness of her own hands, the complete absence of trembling that had defined her entire adult life. She had finally found the perfect balance between fear and courage, between training and instinct, between serving herself and serving others. As she packed up her equipment and prepared to leave the mall, Sarah realized that her career had come full circle. She had started as a scared young woman whose hands shook uncontrollably and who everyone believed was unsuitable for dangerous work. But she had learned something that her instructors and teammates and critics had never understood. Her shaking hands were not a weakness to overcome, they were a strength to embrace, a constant reminder that what she was doing mattered, that lives were at stake, that she needed to be better than perfect. Sarah Chen retired from active duty 6 months later after 20 years of service, during which she successfully disarmed over 400 explosive devices and saved thousands of lives. She became a civilian contractor specializing in training other explosive ordnance disposal specialists. But her reputation was not built on her technical skills or her success rate or her awards and commendations. Sarah was remembered and respected for something much more important, for proving that courage is not the absence of fear but the ability to act. Despite fear, she taught students around the world that physical limitations are often psychological advantages, that the people who seem least suited for dangerous work sometimes become the most reliable and effective operators, that steady hands are less important than a steady heart. Sarah never stopped having trembling hands, but she learned to see them as a gift rather than a curse, a constant reminder that every bomb she faced was a life or death situation that required her absolute best effort and complete attention. The little girl in the pink dress grew up to become a teacher. I never forgot the woman who saved her life in the mall food courts. She named her own daughter Sarah and told her the story of how sometimes the people who seem most afraid are actually the bravest of all. Years later, when Sarah Chen was asked about her career and her legacy, she always gave the same answer. She said that she had been privileged to serve people who never knew her name, to protect strangers who became her reason for getting up every morning, to prove that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have a cause worth fighting for. Her hands still shake when she gets nervous or scared or excited. But Sarah Chen has learned that some things are worth shaking for, worth being afraid for, worth risking everything for, and that the greatest courage is not in having steady hands but in having a steady purpose. The bomb in the food court was defused with 7 seconds left on the timer. But Sarah Chen's real victory was not in those final seconds. It was in every moment of every day when she chose to serve others despite her fears, despite her limitations, despite everyone who said she wasn't strong enough. She proved that heroes are not born with special abilities or perfect bodies or fearless hearts. Heroes are made in moments when ordinary people decide that someone else's life is more important than their own safety. When shaking hands becomes steady, not because the fear goes away but because love is stronger than fear. And somewhere in a small town, a hardware store owner and a third-grade teacher tell everyone who will listen about their daughter Sarah, who was afraid of fireworks as a child but grew up to face bombs with courage, who had trembling hands that became rock steady when people needed her most. They don't talk about her awards or her success rate or her technical expertise. They talk about the day their scared little girl decided that helping other people was worth being afraid for, and how she spent her entire career proving that the bravest thing anyone can do is show up when people need help, even when your hands are shaking, especially when your hands are shaking. Because sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable are actually the strongest, sometimes the people who appear most afraid are actually the most courageous, and sometimes the hands that shake the most are exactly the hands that the world needs to stay steady when everything else is falling apart. Sarah Chen learned that fear is not the enemy of courage, it is the raw material from which courage is made, and that the distance between being too scared to help and too determined to quit is measured not in steady hands but in the steady beat of a heart that refuses to let other people down. Her story became legend in military circles, not because she was fearless but because she was full of fear and decided to serve anyway, not because her hands were steady but because her purpose was unshakable, not because she was born to be a hero but because she chose every day to become one. And in the end, that choice is what separates those who protect from those who need protection, not the absence of fear but the presence of something stronger than fear, something that turns trembling hands into instruments of salvation and ordinary people into exactly the heroes that the world needs most.